After years of relative calm, there's been a new upturn in violence in Nigeria's northeast. Estimates suggest more people were killed in the first half of this year than last year. In total, a resurgence of Islamist attacks is contributing to the rising numbers. DW's Fanny Facsar and her team traveled to Borno State, where the armed Islamist group Boko Haram and an Islamic State splinter group are ramping up their attacks.
We are in Borno State, in the heartland of an insurgency primarily driven by the militant Islamist group Boko Haram and its rival faction, the Islamic State's West Africa province, or ISWAP. Ali, not his real name, says he was a commander in ISWAP for almost a decade. 2 years ago, he left the Islamist group in an amnesty deal offered by the Nigerian government to reintegrate militants into society. But now he says he's ready to take up arms again.
The government promised us jobs. That was the agreement. I don't have anything. No food, no job. When we go back, we are going to attack. Fight a war so we can eat and feed our families.
Ali is from Maiduguri, Borno's capital city in Nigeria's northeast. After a few years of relative calm in the region, there has been a renewed spate of attacks.
Our husbands were killed because of attacks. Children are growing up without their parents. We are scared of a resurgence of attacks.
At least 12 people were killed and many injured in June outside of Maiduguri. A suspected female suicide bomber detonated her explosives at a market. All indications point to either Boko Haram or ISWAP as being behind the attack.
While no group claimed responsibility for this bombing, there's been a wave of recent Islamist attacks in Nigeria's northeast, especially here in Borno State, including attacks on military outposts and civilians.
Modu Omate survived a roadside bomb a few months ago on the way to his farmland. He lost one of his legs in the explosion.
I'm scared. 8 people were killed that day. The military is not doing enough. Everyone was relaxed because it had been peaceful, but that was negligence. The military wasn't pursuing the militants. That's why they're strong again.
Nigeria's military has been stretched thin, confronted with multiple flashpoints across the country, and reintegration projects like the one here are important. But Borno State Commissioner admits that the program is not perfect.
Reintegration is working. It's work in progress. It's not everything that former insurgents wants that will be given to them. We have the victims to deal with. If we over-resource the insurgents, the victims will say, okay, what about us?
But experts warn, tackling terrorism won't work without addressing poverty and unemployment.
If we are not taken care of, if the government doesn't deliver, the attacks will escalate. It will not end.
Ali claims he doesn't believe in ISWAP's ideology anymore, but he's still planning to rejoin the terrorist group. Many, he says, who surrendered with him are ready to follow suit.
And I'm joined now from the Nigerian capital, Abuja, by Kabir Adamu. He's a security analyst and managing director of Beacon Consulting. Welcome, Kabir. What do you think is behind the recent surge in violence in northeastern Nigeria?
Thank you and good evening. So there are several factors, some of them political, others economic, then the environmental issues, as well as gaps in the security deployment. And then, of course, developments in the Sahel region that are also impacting security in Nigeria. The borders are porous, and so whenever the insurgents and their membership, as well as their equipment, is brought into Nigeria, it helps increase the security challenges. There are also issues that have to do with increase in several deployments by the military, and so this has stretched the military team, just like your reporter mentioned in her report. Other factors have to do with the call by the global franchises. So IS, Islamic State, as well as Al-Qaeda, also from time to time make calls, and these calls are responded to by their local affiliates in Nigeria. So it's a combination of these economic, political, social, and environmental factors that have led to the resurgence.
Before we continue, I'd like to know from you if those two groups that we're talking about, ISWAP and Boko Haram, are they acting independently or are they coordinating their attacks in a way?
So they're acting independently and they are actually rivals. So we've seen fratricidal attacks where either side attacked the other. And if you recall, it was ISWAP that killed the infamous commander of what everybody refers to as Boko Haram, that's the Jamaatul Ahli Sunnah Lil Zawat wal Jihad, otherwise known as Shekau. So that fratricidal attacks has been ongoing, and it's part of the reason why we saw a lull in their attacks last year and in 2023.
The government had adopted an approach of de-radicalization and reintegration of militants. Has that failed?
So there hasn't been an independent evaluation of the entire process. It's called Operation Safe Corridor. The initial intention was for it not to be managed by the military. Unfortunately, it's now being managed almost completely by the military, even though there are involvement of the academia, religious clerics, but there hasn't been any independent evaluation. So it would be really difficult, and I think it would be unfair to reach that conclusion that it has failed. It is an important component of the counter-terrorism strategy that Nigeria has, and I think the fact that it has been ongoing for almost a decade means perhaps there are some levels of successes. But what is important is to have an independent evaluation so that what it has done well would be, continued, and where there are gaps, just of course, like we've noted, there are gaps, those gaps can be corrected. So I would really call on the Nigerian government and the international partners that are supporting that Operation Safe Corridor to have an independent evaluation of the process.
Aid organizations say more than 1 million people are now facing starvation as a combined result, really, of the jihadist attacks, but also rising living costs and cuts in foreign aid. What can the government do to regain control of the situation and avoid a hunger crisis?
So this is a very tricky situation in the sense that whatever development and humanitarian practitioner preaches against has happened in Nigeria. That is dependence. Over the last few years, up to a decade, humanitarian aid organizations have been supporting, humanitarian interventions in Nigeria. Unfortunately, due to developments in the United States and in Europe, aid funding has been cut significantly, and so the likelihood of an end to these intervention programs is extremely high. And warnings have been issued by the United Nations and several other development partners and humanitarian actors to show that their funding provisions for Nigeria has reduced tremendously. Now, what the government needs to do is to enhance both federal and state government interventions. Unfortunately, we're not hearing enough of that. Nigeria has several components of its intervention program for the needy that is being implemented by its Ministry of Humanitarian Affairs. There are also several local non-governmental organizations such as the Dangote Foundation, the Boa Foundation, and several others that need to come together under an organized framework to support and to fill this gap that will be created by the cut in funds by both the United States and EU.
The security analyst Kabir Adamu in Abuja. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Let's dig a little deeper and bring in Ayandele. She's a clinical assistant professor at New York University's Center for Global Affairs. Welcome back to DW. Now, remind us what these jihadist groups actually want to achieve in Nigeria.
Thank you for having me back. It's always a pleasure. So groups like ISWAP and Boko Haram are really trying to establish a Islamic caliphate. And this Islamic caliphate is governed by their own interpretation of Sharia law. But this isn't just an ideology. They're trying to also control territory, people, economic resources, particularly in undergoverned areas in spaces like the Lake Chad Basin. So the agenda is both political and strategic, which is to replace the authority of many states within this region.
So there's overlap in their agenda, but do they cooperate? Do they act independently? Do they act against each other even?
Yes, all of it. It's a very complex and very nuanced situation. So on the one hand, we have seen a growing level of coordination, especially when we see Islamic linked groups or Al-Qaeda linked groups when they cooperate and share strategies with one another. But there has also been a lot of infighting between, the Islamic State affiliated groups as well as Al-Qaeda affiliated groups within the territory. And this is just to win the hearts and minds of local populations so that they can continue to expand their operations. So we have seen them sharing tactics, coordinating, exploiting borders. And right now, as you know, with the Islamic State, ISWAP, the Islamic State of West African Province, is now considered one of its most effective affiliates globally.
What do you think is behind the surge in violence we're seeing in Nigeria right now?
That's a very good and nuanced question. For the most part, it's the tactical evolution. We have heard from reports on the ground that groups such as ISWAP, the Islamic State of West African Province, have been able to, deploy night attacks against military posts. We've seen their use of drones. We've seen better coordination, and we've seen increased clashes between this group as well as military forces and joint task forces with the MNJTF, the regional force, as well as the civilian joint task force. So we've seen fatalities, we've seen events going up more, and we've seen that these attacks are very, very lethal. And as your correspondent has said, programs like Operation Safe Corridor, while well-intentioned, have really struggled with trust, transparency, and the long-term reintegration of some of these ex-Boko Haram fighters, and the ability of, the government to also appease victims that were attacked by Boko Haram.
What would you say have been the biggest mistakes in tackling the insurgency?
I would say definitely two key missteps. So, with the Nigerian government and with what's going on in the Northeast, there has been an over-reliance on kinetic force, on traditional ways of thinking about war. And this is not to say that isn't necessary, but there's a need for us to do security and development side by side, not security first and then development after. So without parallel political and economic interventions, when we see the military being deployed, I would say that has been one of the key missteps, especially in the Northeast. And I would say the second one has been the premature return of displaced persons. I know that is one way the government has shown that reintegration efforts are working, but when you return displaced people prematurely, especially to insecure areas where there isn't necessarily any military presence, that has really exposed them to renewed attacks by some of these jihadist groups.
What does this rise in violence mean for the lives of everyday Nigerians?
It definitely deepens insecurity, and we are going to see an increased humanitarian need in the region. We continue to see communities displaced again and again. Schools, hospitals continue to remain closed. We've seen trade routes disrupted. And for millions of Nigerians, their daily lives have become a gamble between survival and flight. So it's very, very, very telling what this rise in violence has meant for a lot of people who live in Borno State, especially in border communities.
How well equipped is the security apparatus to deal with all of this?
Yes, the Nigerian security force is stretched thin. As your correspondent had rightly said, Nigeria is facing multiple threats on different fronts. So from terrorism in the Northeast to banditry in the Northwest to piracy to kidnapping. And we've seen that this limited resources and a lot of bureaucratic delays have really hampered the coordination that is needed. So the system as we know it is strained and very reactive versus proactive, and the proactiveness is what is needed if we're going to win this war against terrorism.
There's Juma Ayandele, Clinical Assistant Professor at New York University Center for Global Affairs. Thank you so much. It was great to have you on the show again.
Thank you.
And for more on this, I'm now joined by Okonkwo. He's a researcher at the Department of History at the University of Ghana and specializes in conflict resolution in African separatist movements. He joins us from Lagos today. Oge, thanks for joining us. How much of this renewed violence is driven by economic desperation rather than ideology?
Thank you very much for this opportunity and the platform. To answer your question, the situation in the northeast part of Nigeria is, in short, like you rightly mentioned, driven by poverty, unemployment, and weak local governance. In short, the military's reliance on super camps has ceded areas like Mate and Lake Chad smuggling routes to the insurgents. Also, there has been a disconnect in coordination between the federal and state authorities. Moreover, the comeback is as a result of more sophisticated tactics, which include the use of drones and night attacks. And one, if you would allow me, a solution I would prefer would be that if the government has ignored this threat, hence the need for a more integrated political, economic security reforms.
Now, Nigeria's approach to combat this violence are de-radicalization and reintegration. Do you think that's failing?
Yes, because I would say partially yes, because the approach is basically from a conventional security approach or point of view, in that it is not human-centered. It is rather based on the preservation of Nigeria's territorial integrity and also Nigeria's sovereignty. So what Nigeria's military must do is to shift from their defensive super camp strategy to a proactive, intelligence-driven operation strategy, which include, aside the conventional weapons, which include combat drone technology, enhancing night vision capabilities, and rapid response tactics and intelligence. What the government needs to do is to address poverty and also tackle governance failures. If not, a second wave of terrorism could overwhelm an overstretched military.
Isn't the military already overstretched, facing multiple crises at once?
Exactly. In short, the situation is quite dire in that if you look at Nigeria today, you have the police and you have the military. Now, ideally, the military is responsible for warding off any attack by the Constitution, warding off any attack on the country's territorial integrity, right? But you have a situation because of how overstretched they are in numbers. A situation whereby internal security, which is meant to be manned by domestic security forces and apparatus like the police, you find them being handled by military commanders. For instance, you see checkpoints in the northeast, you see checkpoints in the southeast of Nigeria, you see checkpoints almost everywhere manned by the soldiers and the military. So that is how serious the situation is in terms of how overstretched the military service branches are.
Okay, Okonkwo, thank you very much for your insight into this matter.